How's it? And welcome back to the Burton Builds garage. In today's video, we look at step by step how I changed the front shocks on my vehicle. So let's get started. The vehicle that we are working on today is my 2006 model Toyota Hilux 2.7 VVTi, and it's the 4x2. Now, this procedure will probably work for mostly any other vehicle, so whether you've got the 4x4 bakkie, pickup truck or a car, it should still work. Just remember to check with your maintenance manual the specifications that you're going to need, and also maybe with your service repair agent. Maybe there are specific procedures that you need to follow on your specific vehicle to complete this job safely. So, what tools are we going to need? First up, you're going to need a couple of spanners, so likely a 14, 17, and a 19 in my specific case. This is a 50, you don't need that. Probably a small shifting spanner, something like this is probably way too big. And the other things that you may need are some coil spring compressors, and also my specific ones use a number 21mm spanner, so your mileage may vary. Some of the other things that you are probably definitely going to need today is a jack and a jack stands. Now, please don't work under your car just using a jack. Always use jack stands, and remember, these things are only safe when they are installed and located or used correctly underneath a vehicle, so make sure you do that. Something else that might make the job a little bit easier, and thankfully I had one, is a impact wrench, for those stubborn bolts. I chose to go buy my shocks at Toyota, so got them directly from the Toyota Service Center. Now, you can get these from third-party manufacturers and fitment centers, not a problem. And funny enough, these cost the same as what the third-party fitment centers were quoting. Although that did include fitting, I have to fit these myself, so not a problem for myself in the garage. Likewise, that's probably why you are here. You're going to fit yours by yourself. As for the quality of these things, I do prefer to use the original parts where possible. Of course, these are going to be designed to Toyota's specs, so for the damping rates, etc. Toyota is not going to supply you with a part that they are not happy with. Comparing that to possibly a third-party manufacturer, not going to name any names, of course, but they may be making generic shocks just with different mounting points on that'll suit your vehicle. You're going to need two of these, likely two of them. You generally replace the two front ones or the two back ones as a set, or maybe all four together. How long is it going to take to do this job? Well, that's probably going to be dependent on how skilled you are. Probably, if you're pretty competent, around 2 hours, maybe 3 hours if you're a little bit slower. So if it's 5:30 and your wife is wanting to go for supper at 6:30, don't start this job. Also, there are other videos like this on my channel. Some of them have already been published. Some of them are still in the works. So if you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe. Click that little bell icon so that you don't miss out on any future content. Okay, let's get started. We start off by moving the bakkie into the garage. As I always try and do, I prefer working in the garage, outside and away from the dirt and dust. For this job, I found it easier to jack up the entire front of the vehicle and set it sturdy on some jack stands. That way, both of the front wheels can be removed and the suspension hangs nice and low. In order to get the shock out, we need to let these lower control arms just drop a little bit more than what the current setup is at the moment. And what is hindering the process is actually this anti-roll bar. So what we need to do is, that's why we need to jack the entire front of the car up. And we're actually going to we're going to unbolt this roll bar. And you can see I've started over here already. It had a bracket. It went over there with just 2 bolts. So I've taken those off, and then we're also going to remove this little link here. We'll be able to pull this roll bar out, and because the other side is also loose, it is now going to be completely loose and able to move around. Now I'll remove 3 nuts that secure the top shock mount to the chassis. In this case, if you have a ratchet spanner, use it, because that will definitely go a whole lot faster than the way I'm trying to do it. Once that is done, we can remove the lower shock mounting bolt, and an impact wrench makes this super easy and quick to do. You'll notice that I'm leaning with my body weight over the brake caliper, and as I do this, I'm able to wiggle the bolt and remove it. Once that's removed, I'm applying a downward pressure onto the lower control arm once again, and that is to release the bottom of the shock from the mounting bracket. Now that the bottom of the shock is clear, it can easily be removed. I'll need to compress the spring so that I can remove the retaining nut and shock at the top of the shock's shaft. In order to do this, we need to use two spring compressors. These are basically long bolts with a hooked nut at each end, and when the bolt is turned, the nuts pull closer together, which in turn compresses the spring. I've hooked the spring compressors opposite to each other and as close as possible to the first and last coil of the spring. One thing to remember when using these, wear safety glasses and preferably gloves. When compressed, a spring of this size packs a mean punch. It will have a lot of potential energy stored up, and if one of those hooks breaks or slips in a millisecond, you're going to have shit flying everywhere. So use these things very, very carefully. And this is why you'll see me slowly winding them up with a spanner, each side a little bit at a time. This way I can feel the tension being equally taken up by both sides. Now, of course, you could probably do this with a power tool like an impact wrench or a drill driver. I just prefer not to do it because I've got more control doing it manually. Once the spring is compressed enough to just be off the shock mount plate at the top of the shock's shaft, I'll grab the top of the shaft with a shifting spanner and loosen the nut. And I suppose you could also grab the top of the shock with a vice grip instead of a shifting spanner. Hey, look, whatever floats your boat. Once the nut is removed, the shock mounting plate can be removed and the shock pulled out of the spring. You'll also notice I'm doing this carefully because I don't want to chance bumping any of the hooks and the whole thing springs apart. You'll also need to remove the washer from the shaft. Together with this washer is a rubber bumper type washer, which you can't really see here. It's actually still stuck underneath the shock mounting plate. We can see the old and the new shock match in design and construction, and they also perfectly match in length. Probably a good thing to check. Now, this is not exactly a scientific test, but comparing the old shocks to the new ones, pressing down equally hard on each of them, we can see that the older one compresses a little bit easier than the newer one. While it doesn't look like there is much difference between the two, after playing around with both of them for a while, pulling them, pushing them, and giving them a good work through, I can feel that the older one has seen better days. Out with the old, in with the new. Believe it or not, installing the new shocks is pretty much the reverse of removing the old ones. Firstly, sliding on the lower support washer and making sure that the rubber bumper type washer is still stuck under the shock mount. If it wasn't, we would need to slide that on top of the steel washer and then stick the whole lot through the spring and into the shock mount. Make sure you line up the end of the spring with the seating position on the shock, and we can see at the top it's also still aligned. Once all of this is correct, we slide on the upper rubber bumper and steel washer. The new nut that came with the shock differs slightly from the old one, and looking closer, the older nut is a flange nut, and I actually prefer the older one, so I'm going to reuse it. Now all that's left to do is tighten up the nut and install the shock assembly back onto the bakkie. Again, installation is pretty much the opposite of taking it out. I'll slide the shock assembly up into place, making sure to align the 3 bolts at the top and turn on the nuts. Hand tight for now is good enough. Next up is to get the bottom of the shock into its mounting plate. To do this, you'll see me leaning down on the brake caliper and basically bouncing the lower control arm to create space for the shock to slip back into position. Once that's done, an old screwdriver makes easy work of aligning the bolt holes, allowing me to insert the bolt and tighten it up. Now that the bottom is tight, I can move back up to the top and tighten up those 3 nuts. With both shock and spring assemblies installed, I can reinstall the roll bar, remembering to tighten it up at both wheel sides and also the 2 mounting points along the front edge of the chassis. And chaps, that's it. Do also remember to put the wheels back onto your vehicle and tighten those wheel nuts correctly. Not too sure why, but vehicles just don't tend to handle that well when the wheels come off. Also, take it for a test drive, make sure the shocks are working correctly, there's no funny noises, and that type of thing. If you found this video useful, please give it a thumbs up and let us know in the comments what you thought about the video, and maybe share your experiences about working on your vehicles. If you haven't subscribed, please consider subscribing and click that little bell icon so that you don't miss out on any future content. Chaps, I suppose that is it. We'll see you in the next video. Cheers.